Welcome to the Advanced Women's Health Podcast, where we empower women with the latest insights and advice on holistic health. From cutting-edge medical research to practical wellness tips, our mission is to help you thrive at every stage of life. Join us as we explore topics ranging from hormonal balance and reproductive health to nutrition and mental well-being. Whether you're seeking solutions for a specific health concern or simply want to enhance your overall wellness, you're in the right place. Let's embark on this journey to better health together. This is the Advanced Women's Health Podcast. Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of the Advanced Women's Health Podcast. I am so excited to intro today's podcast because it's a bit of a different style of podcast again. So whenever we have a new style, I like to come on and intro it. And today's episode, we are going to be going behind the scenes into one of the Advanced Women's Health Practitioner education calls. So as I mentioned historically, we value education and collaboration and excellence and community. And so that shows up for the practitioners like us meeting every day to go through clinical rounds. And some of those calls are directly related to patient cases. So patients have challenging cases or the practitioner wants a different set of eyes. And that's always the benefit, right? Is that you are getting multiple sets of eyes on your case if there is a challenge or things aren't going in the direction that we expect. And so in that, we are doing sometimes those calls, and then sometimes we are doing education calls. So I wanted you to be behind the scenes and to hear a little bit about some of our education calls and how that goes and how we structure and how we educate, because I think the education that I'm giving the practitioners is also really helpful for you guys to be able to integrate and hear and learn in your own life. And we got a theme going, so I figured let's jump in, let's talk about the nervous system, and let's really look at pulling behind the scenes, right? Pulling back the curtains on what it looks like to work together with a whole team of practitioners that value education and excellence. So dive in, and I hope you enjoy.
Okay, so today we are going to dive into nervous system stuff. You guys ask a lot of really great questions about like picking different products and like how you pick different products and how all of that kind of stuff works. So I want to do a big overview of the nervous system because again, like it's such a foundational piece. And I think even how we use the word stress does a disservice to what we're actually talking about. So first and foremost, what is stress? Like when we're talking about stress, what's stress? What am I talking about?
Yeah, so it can be external stressors, so things from our environment causing our body to act a certain way, or internal demands, like things that are dysregulated or off balance, not getting enough nutrition, mental stressors. And then our stress response is either going to be like your sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, adrenaline, norepinephrine, or it's going to be cortisol being released and that stress response. So, like the two divisions of it.
Perfect. Let's go more into detail. So what are internal stressors?
Blood sugar regulation, inflammation, or
Mhm.
like an immune response causing inflammation.
Yeah, but you can also have like sterile inflammation to
Yeah.
something that's not a direct cause. So yeah, totally. Nutrient deficiencies,
Yes.
that's a big source of stress, right? We've got mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress. It's a source of stress, literally oxidative stress, which comes with mitochondrial dysfunction. So those are the big ones, right? Like those are the big categories of internal stressors. And I think it's really important that you're constantly running that list in your head. One, because in my experience, every time you tell someone that you think there's stress going on, they're immediately thinking that you're talking about work stress or relationship stress or something else. So when you say to someone, yeah, like I think we really should dive deeper into what's going on from like a stress perspective, and this could be related to a stress response. By stress, I mean blood sugar dysregulation, inflammation and infection, bacterial imbalances in the gut, nutrient deficiencies, challenges with your body's ability to produce energy, challenges with your body's ability to clean up dysfunction. All of those are sources of stress in addition to mental emotional stress. So when I'm talking about stress today, I'm going to be talking about all of those different components. So I'm not just telling you to go meditate on a mountain and like everything will be fine. And I think it's a really important way to preface a conversation because I'll often say to patients, mental emotional stress is the last drop in the bucket. You can be having a very stressful day with very balanced blood sugar, and you will be in a very different position than outside of that. And so identifying, helping people identify that is really critical. So I love that. The next piece we talk through is how stress comes about in the body, right? So the body senses a change from balance or homeostasis, right? So something moving out of balance or moving out of what we call homeostasis. I will say to patients, it's like the thermostat, right? So what happens is we have this thermostat set in our body for every different system, right? Our brain is constantly sampling, interpreting every different system in the body. And so as soon as we move outside of a comfortable range, we are using a stress response in some way, shape, or form to get back to where we want to be. Just like we use our air conditioner or our heat, we are using some component of signaling and stress responses, right? We're trying to effect change to get back to that place. And so our goal is not to never deviate, but our goal is to not deviate outside of the boundaries of homeostasis and what our body's trying to do. So then that goes back to the conversation that like stress, fundamentally, we start interpreting that at the level of the brain. So that also means that brain inflammation can change how your body perceives stress and signals stress. That means that mental emotional factors, hormonal factors, right? Nutrient deficiencies, again, all those stressors can change the degree of resilience you have in your system, because resilience is the ability to move to the edges of homeostasis and come back to balance without activating massive stress responses. And that's all resilience is, the ability to come back. And so what we're trying to do is create a state mental, emotionally, or neurologically that there's safety in moving, navigating away, and coming back. That's a really critical piece of this. And so this is important when we're talking about herbs and when we're talking about all of those other things, because foundationally, the more research you do, the more you'll realize that what they're doing is changing perception. And the more blood sugar imbalance you have, the more inflammation you have, the more sensitive we are to that system perceiving stress, right? It's like the last drop in the bucket situation. And so it's also acknowledging and identifying that. I find like making stress very biochemical is helpful, especially in your patients that are really resistant to the thought of being stressed or to the thought that like their anxiety is related or like overwhelmed by their anxiety, I should say. Right. So it's really like bringing it back to the core foundations of like all stress is at the end of the day is moving outside of our boundaries. And that's including like going back to the conversation we were having earlier. My boundaries around what I can handle in a day without calling it stressful have expanded with time, right? Like historically, if someone threatened to sue me, I would be like on the floor. Now you're like, come at me. Come at me, bro. It's not going to go well for you. You know what I mean? But it's those types of things that expand with time. Whereas, like, I can ask someone for a conversation and they can just about shit their pants because they think they're getting fired, right? That eventually goes away, right? People are like, oh, like she's just good. But that's where we're constantly expanding those boundaries. So what my body perceives as stress and what your body perceives as stress is very different. But what we need to understand is the boundaries around resilience, right? How far can you go and come back in? And that's what we're stretching, that muscle, that's what we're stretching. That's what we're trying to figure out. And so the more, like, if you kind of view it like a bullseye, right? The more inflammation you have, the more issues you have with blood sugar, the closer you have to stay to get back without activating this huge stress response. Whereas as we pull those layers back, you have more breadth, you have more challenges that you can go through and not be brought down by it. And I think that, again, just that thought process is really helpful for patients because they do not think about it that way, I promise you. And so it's just, again, breaking those things into pieces. So we've got that from like, what is stress, what that looks like. Okay. Now we have to get into the different layers of how people respond to stress. So that is biochemically what stress is. When we talk about how people respond, what are the 4 different sympathetic patterns in the body? So how would freeze present? This is where sometimes from a depression standpoint, we spend a lot of time trying to get our patients to go. We're trying to push them, we're trying to stimulate them, we're trying to get them going. But depression can actually be a functional freeze response, right? It can be, this is why the line between anxiety and depression is almost useless clinically, to be completely honest, because you can alternate in and out of it. And like, obviously, you can have major depressive disorder that neurochemically there are differences that we need to acknowledge. But when we're talking about like average functional depression, we are looking at it from the perspective of, is this someone's free state? Meaning they would actually respond well to nervines, right? They actually respond very well to passion flower and ziziphus and valerian and California poppy, right? Because it's slowing the fight or flight response enough that they can get going. Or is this a state where we need more serotonin support, right? We need more St. John's wort. We need more saffron. We need more HTP. We need to improve serotonin signaling. We need to reduce inflammation. We know depression, especially like major depressive disorder, is hugely like based in insulin resistance and inflammation in a massive way. And so we're looking at, okay, which category is that person fitting in? But that can be a freeze response. And I feel like that's one of the most overlooked subtypes of depression, right? When you have a patient that you just can't get going, people will try, they're tired, right? They're like, I'm shut down, I'm tired, I can't get up. And people, we try to stimulate them and stimulate them and stimulate them, and it's just not working, right? And it's because they're bathed in norepinephrine and epinephrine. So we can see in the research, people with depression, subcategories of people with MDD can have really high cortisol that they're not responding to, and they can have high levels of epinephrine. If someone is stuck in a like low serotonin state, we don't necessarily expect to see that. So it's understanding that. So that's one type. Okay. So we've got freeze. So how do the other ones present? A fight response is the person who just like gets shit done, right? Like they're just going through their to-do list 20,000 miles an hour. And everyone else from an external standpoint can be like, oh my gosh, look how productive that person is. But it depends on where that energy is coming from. I'll always say to people, it's great that you get a lot done. Are your feet on the fucking floor when you do it? Right? Are you getting a lot done because you're in the flow and you're feeling productive and everything's working for you? Or are you getting a lot done because you're so anxious that you're just like giving her? There are huge differences. And for most people, it depends on the day, right? Like I would say the mass majority of days I get a lot done because that's how my brain works. And I've built a life where I get to work in my zone of genius. There's a 20% of days where I get a lot done because I'm like running, right? Like I'm like in full fight mode. So you have to look at that. So when we're getting into that flight mode, yeah, it's that doing everything except what you need to do. It's avoiding things. It's ghosting, right? And instead of dealing with something, it's running from something. That is a big piece of it. They're not tackling things head on. They have a whole list of things in their life that if they just had the conversation, if they just talked to someone, you know what I mean? If they just dealt with it, then their stress response would lower. For example, with food stuff, right? All they need to do is sit down and plan it and then go to the grocery store. And instead, they just grab takeout. That's another example, right? Of like, you're just running from what you need to look at or deal with. Yeah, people who forget supplements, that kind of stuff as well. Like they're just like so frantic, they're just running. Again, I think the fight response is often under recognized as because it's viewed as like outside of anger and aggression, which it can show up as anger and aggression. Absolutely. For a lot of specifically the women that we're supporting, it shows up as like wild productivity. Like they're just like, just go. So that can be another one. And then the fawn response is again, like I would say that's the one we see most frequently, but it's one that we have to ask a lot of questions about. Like when you walk around and you caretake everyone else around you, are you doing that at the expense of yourself and your own needs? If you are, I would call that a stress response. Even just saying that word to those patients, right? To be like, if you are caretaking everyone else at the expense of yourself, that is a stress response. Pretty much everyone can identify with that at some point in their life. And so it just helps to bring awareness to how these patterns show up. Because again, for the mass majority of our patients, they associate stress responses with a panic attack, a busy meeting, at work, but like they associate it with chaos and like the edge of a breakdown. They don't understand all of the pieces that got them to that place. And so we are in this world right now where people are cycling on burnout because they have no awareness of what the pattern looks like that got them there, right? They're just like, I just hit the floor and then I'm there for 3 months and then I get back up and then I hit the floor again 6 months later. They're like, I'm in this constant cycle. And it's because they don't recognize that it's actually their blood sugar and their inflammation and their nutrient deficiencies and all of these small behaviors, like how they're being productive, like how they're taking care of everyone else, like what they're running from in their life. It's all of that work that needs to be done to break out of that loop. And in each of those situations, we look, what do you need to do to break a fawn response? You need to stop caretaking everyone else around you at the expense of yourself. That's not easy, right? Because, and this is, our patients get that reinforcing cycle all day long because they're in this situation where they're like, okay, well, I stopped taking care of everyone else. And then there was no food in the fridge. There was nothing else. Like, you know what I mean? Like nothing was done. Everything, all the projects at work fell down and then it came back on my plate. There was no food in the fridge and my partner didn't magically understand what to do and all of the things I do all day. There was no clean laundry. And I'm like, whoa. Yep. So I acknowledge that you've identified this pattern, but you need to also then go and put in place the mechanisms to offload, right? Like it has to happen methodically. It has to happen step by step. You can't just decide you're not going to fawn anymore. You can't just, someone who's in a flight response can't just decide to sit down and tackle their entire to-do list, right? You need a plan. You need a system. You need all of these things in place. When it comes to the freeze response, they need herbs first, right? So you need to give that patient 2 to 4 weeks of herbs to break that pattern and then get them going. So it's acknowledging where we are in the pattern of treatment in order to acknowledge where we need to take that patient in terms of next steps, not only with supplements and labs, but also realistically with their life. Because the reality is for most of our patients, they've spent a couple decades building this pattern into their life. And we can't expect that it's going to be 2 weeks when they get their way out of it, right? They have to learn how to resource people, learn all of those types of things. And so it's a huge part of the conversation that we need to be having with patients is like when they identify what type of stress response they have and how they sit with it, to then be like, okay, now what's resourcing look like? Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, right? Is that getting a babysitter? Is that creating a list of staples that your partner is going to help pick up? Is that just ordering food on PC Express and going and picking it up as opposed to doing all of the grocery shopping? Is that ordering a meal delivery service? And then saying, if you have a teenager and doesn't want to eat it, you're fending for your effing self, right? Like whatever that looks like, helping to have like a resource package for all of those different stress responses. It's for me, right? Let's say I was operating 60% of the time frantically from a place of the fight response. If I just stopped doing that, people are going to continue to hand me work and opportunities at the same rate as I was last week. So then now what's going to happen? I'm going to get overwhelmed. So you need in that situation, you need to teach someone. And I had to do that a few years ago, right? I needed to like slow down slowly and help people understand what my capacity was. And at the same time, hire and resource for different roles and capacities. So you need to think through this methodically. And I encourage you guys to do it for yourself first, honestly, because we all have stress responses and figure out like, what would that plan look like for me? Because then it's more effective to help people roll it out. Because I can guarantee you, ain't nobody going to be working on their inflammation, their blood sugar, their hormonal health, their mitochondrial health if they're in one of these stress response dominantly, like AKA more than 60% of the time. So that's why so much of the time we're picking nervines or something like that, because it's actually slowing the role of all of these patterns so that we can start to pattern recognize and break patterns and then move forward.
Today's episode is brought to you by none other than Advanced Women's Health. If you are interested in diving in deeper to your health, if you are finally ready to feel like yourself, and you are finally over hearing everything's normal, everything's fine, and you want a deeper dive into your healthcare, then we are here to help you. We are currently helping patients in British Columbia and Ontario, Canada. But don't worry, if you're in another province, still reach out, get added to the wait list as we expand coast to coast. We cannot wait to work with you. Check out the show notes for more information on how to get started.
So now we get into products. So when we're looking at, for example, like the flatline people is an easy one, because in those people that are completely flatlined, right? Again, that could be a subcategory of depression. So it's acknowledging where do they fit within that. But then it's also saying, is this person out of gas? Like, are they physically driving on the highway out of gas? What is gas in the gas tank? It's mitochondrial support, right? So it's going down that road and being like, okay, let's give you some more fuel here. If that person's fueled up and they're still not going, that's that connection. That's when signaling is becoming a challenge. So that's when we get into the situation where, like, okay, we go towards like beyond burnout. We go towards more stimulating herbs. We go towards our ginsengs, right? Like we're in that space where it's like you're adding a spark to a full tank. That's when people are like totally flatlined, right? When we get into the category of the I'm finers, they can go in either direction. It's either people, again, that are so spun out and they're so anxious. They're like, it's good. I'm good. Like, blah, 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 right? Then you're using your nerve vines. You're like valerian, your passion flower, your ziziphus, your California poppies. You know what I mean? So we've got that, right? We've got those types of pattern responses where we're trying to like bring someone down. And then we have the other people that this is kind of where the chill pill came from. So chill pill is Eleutherococcus, ashwagandha, ziziphus, and passion flower. It's for those people who like have a super high volume of things that are coming at them and they just need to do it, right? It's not that their life is stressful. It's just that the volume of things coming at them is stressful. But you see signs in their bodies of anxiety, right? You see signs that they're not handling it well as much as they think they are. So it's not like they're on the floor anxious, right? Like they're not melting down there. It's just they are using that anxiety a little bit more than they should be. But if you gave them something like valerian, they would lose that motivation. It's that like balance point, right? Where you're like, okay, you need some of this, but not too much of this. Whereas when we look at ADR are generally the people that you're trying to prevent the volume of their life from taking them down, right? They're a bit tired, they're a bit off, like they don't feel like themselves, but it's not necessarily going to help with anxiety. It's not necessarily going to help, like it mainly helps with cognitive fatigue. But a huge portion of our patients, even though they don't identify as anxious, and they don't even feel that anxious, if they continued to live their life the way they were, they would get more and more tired and more overwhelmed. So to go back to the beginning part of this conversation, it's Luther's changing the perception of the volume of things that are coming up. It's all about that perception, right? You can have 20 emails to do and like a ton of stuff to do and get done, and you can perceive that as anxiety provoking or not. And I think part of that has to do with your baseline level of anxiety. Part of that has to do with how resourced you are. Going back to talking about sleep, mitochondrial function, energy, all of that kind of stuff. But then the other component of it is just, again, like how capable you are from a resilient standpoint. So for people who you're sure that the volume of things coming at them is causing overwhelm, but they also have big blood sugar things they need to work through and big inflammation things they need to work through, you can use something like ADRPX balance, which is going to, again, create that energy and reduce the perceived overwhelm from those tasks. So like all of you guys studying, if you don't feel anxious, you still should probably be on ADR or like Elutero to some degree. If you feel anxious, then like a bit anxious, but you feel like you're like, okay, I'm doing pretty well, then you would go towards chill pill. If you're like, I'm freaking anxious, like I'm up at night, I'm not sleeping well, like I'm just like feeling all the feels, then valerian calm, right? So that's kind of how we're breaking down those different components, those different neurons. Then we layer in things like stress calm, right? So stress calm has more of that California poppy catnip, like those hypnotics. When we talk about hypnotics, like I think they get a bad rap, but they are really good in the type of person that like a subtle shift in perception is not going to shift the whole problem, right? So where ADR is helpful at changing perspective in someone who already like is in a decent place, stress calm is really good at changing perspective in people who present like a Valerian person, but Valerian doesn't work. That's oftentimes when I'm using stress calm. I don't use it right out the gate, but I do use it a lot in those people who like they look pretty wound up, they look pretty anxious, but you give them Valerian and you don't get a great result because I feel like it works similar, except it's changing perception in a bigger way with the California poppy and things like that. Are there other formulas, herbs, things like that you guys want to kind of DDX and navigate? Those are the biggest ones that we get asked about on calls. Is the difference between beyond burnout, ADR, chill pill, valerian calm, stress calm, relax max. Great. Okay. So we'll do relax max first. Relax Max or Relax Matrix, they're very similar formulas. What they are doing, same with like GABA, theanine, they all fit in this camp. So we have two different camps when it comes to any like stress support supplement. They're really broad camps, but we've got two. So situation A is we're changing the state of someone's physiology. Situation B is the physiological state has already occurred and we're blocking how it's interacting. So GABA, all GABA is doing is binding the GABA receptor to affect change. But that receptor is already bathed in norepinephrine and epinephrine in order for someone to need it. But it works really quickly. So if someone is in a state already where they're going towards a panic attack, they've got that norepinephrine, epinephrine state, they feel like everything's kicking up, you can use GABA to blunt the impacts and to create a sense of calm at the GABA receptor so that the body's not responding as much to that epinephrine, norepinephrine pattern. And so theanine is very similar, right? Theanine, when you already have this stress response kicked off, you can take theanine to create calm levels of focus. Stress arrest is got glycine in it as well, which is good for panic. It's got some B vitamins, but it's essentially like GABA and glycine. And so it's activating those calming receptors and blocking the impacts of some of those hormones that are already there. Relax Max is again very similar. It's got the inositols, it's got more of like those signaling compounds, those receptor compounds. So the benefits is that they work really well together. If you have a patient on valerian calm and they have an acute episode where they're feeling panicked, they can take stress rest or they can take GABA, right? They can take Relax Max and it can bring them down. If you have a patient that it's in the process of you fixing the blood sugar and fixing the inflammation and the nutrient deficiencies and the gut issues and the liver issues, etc. Throughout the whole course of the day, they just still feel kicked up, even though you're working on breaking the patterns with herbs. Then having those available, they work within 20 minutes, right? Like it's great as a rescue. I have a lot of patients that'll just put it in their water throughout the day. So they just get like low grade stress support throughout the course of the whole day, as opposed to like the ups and downs with the herbs. That's another great way to do it, right? You're getting that low grade support throughout the course of that time. So that's really what we're looking at is we're using herbs to change perception, to change state, and to ultimately work to change cortisol, norepinephrine, epinephrine, all that kind of stuff. When those things are in the mix already, that's when our receptor-based work is helpful. That's when the GABAs, the inositols, the theanines, all of those, the glycines, that's when they come into the mix to be supportive. And then replenish is in kind of its own little category. So replenish has ashwagandha and eleuthero, which is really helpful for like the perception of stress, but it's for people who their stress response shows up hormonally as like lack of hormonal resilience. So it's got the shatavari and it has the androgen supportive herbs, right? The royal jelly, that to help to rebuild DHEA levels, to help to rebuild hormonal resilience. So this is very good for that deficient, lack of resilience, hormonally sensitive patient. It's a very specific one to like the stress response that hits hormones. This can be people whose periods go light and like longer and a little bit all over the place. This can be people who feel more stressed right before their periods, but it's really that intertwine. And then obviously, if you test DHEA and you see it's low, it applies to that person. But it's the people that when their resilience is down, it hits their hormones. That's where Replenish comes in the most handy. It's not going to push specifically, aside from like the focus and like that kind of ADR type of calm, it's not going to push specifically to reduce anxiety, this or that, but it's very hormonally focused. DHEA is super involved with inflammatory responses. It can be libido, right? So some patients, it's like when they're stressed, their libido is absolutely absent. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, like when men are stressed, they move towards, when women are stressed, they move away. Biologically, I don't know how that ever happens, but hashtag facts. So there's that piece. So androgens are one of the most stabilizing agents women have in perimenopause and postmenopause. So DHEA, more so DHEA even than testosterone, that is why we call it the hormone of resilience. If your testosterone and DHEA are low and your hormones are fluctuating, then the degree of fluctuation is the degree of symptoms. Whereas if we see that your androgens are here and you're fluctuating up and down, you're going to have a lower magnitude of symptoms. So androgens are incredibly important. It's also like testosterone becomes estradiol. And so from an intrachronology perspective, meaning in the skin, in the bones, in the tissues, right? How testosterone becomes estrogen in the brain, how testosterone becomes estrogen is a really key piece. So if we don't have DHEA and we don't have testosterone, then we're not going to have estradiol. And if we don't have any estradiol signaling postmenopause, it's awful. So it's building resilience in all of those ways. It's resilience in the hormonal fluctuations and shifts. It's resilience metabolically. We know that the cortisol to DHEA ratio is really important for insulin resistance and metabolic health. It's resilience with respect to bone health and immune health. There's a lot of immune health research on DHEA coming out. So that's where it really comes down to all of those kind of hormonal components. And that's why I say it's always easy when we have DHEA tested and we see that it's low on the spectrum to know that's the direction to go. But I have I have a lot of perimenopausal patients on that formula. I would say like that's perimenopause when they feel like metabolically they're struggling with drive and motivation, they're struggling, libido struggling, like a lot of those androgenic symptoms, muscle mass, recovery, like that's when I'm layering in that perimenopausally. I don't use a lot of lavender. I've never seen lavender on its own do what I want it to do. And I think whenever I'm choosing herbs for anything, I'm like, I tend to choose the herbs that have the most functions because we have so many herbs to choose from that I'm like, okay, which is the herb that's going to do the most things for this patient? And with lavender, pretty much all it does is help a bit with mood. Like more specifically, I find like depression or lower mood, and it's a bit of a biofilm buster. So it doesn't have that many functions compared to some of our other herbs that are helping in more ways. So I think lavender, I think it could successfully be included in more formulas, like a St. John's wort, saffron, lavender, you know what I mean? Like that type of formula, I think would be a beauty, but there's not that many of them that exist. And I think that's part of it's because lavender is better as an essential oil because of some of those disruptive properties from a biofilm and like inflammatory perspective. So it can be effective. It's just I very rarely use things that are only good for one thing. With paradoxical anything, you're looking at a couple of things. One, how that person's metabolizing it. So when it enters their body, are they breaking it into the metabolites we are hoping for? Because fundamentally, that's the really cool thing about pretty much everything we give is that the way we give it is not actually what's effective. It's what it's broken down into. So like resveratrol, for example, everyone wants to make resveratrol liposomal and this and that to help absorption. Most of the research on resveratrol shows that the breakdown products of resveratrol are the bioactive components. So resveratrol has to be broken down by the bugs in your gut into bioactive metabolites, and then it has a function. So berberine is very similar. I want berberine to work at the level of the gut to influence insulin resistance, right? Curcumin is the exact same thing. So this whole like turmeric, curcumin, black pepper, no black pepper, like I personally think it's all bullshit, if I'm being honest, because what we see happen is that it is broken down by bugs in the gut into pieces that are then anti-inflammatory. And in the process of doing that, it's changing the type of microbes that are in the gut so that they are more anti-inflammatory. So is it even working in systemic circulation as a whole compound? Probably not, or not to a significant degree. And so it's understanding all of those pieces, which say, okay, well, how is it being broken down? Is it being broken down into the right metabolite? And if it is being broken down into the right metabolite, is this someone's genetic predisposition? Right? As we see in presentations with PMDD, right? Like there's actual changes in the GABA A receptor, right? Is it that? Is it their predisposition? Or is it, and this is the energy of the medicine, right? For some people, their entire safety response is dependent on chaos. So as soon as you slow that chaos, it's like putting the brakes on a speeding transport truck. It's like that body screams to it. It's not safe. So they have these paradoxical responses because their whole system is so set up on that nervous system chaos. This is also why I think when some people drink, they get anxiety, or they smoke weed, they get anxiety. It's like their body's trying to slow them down, and then their norepinephrine, epinephrine just kicks off because they're like, it is not safe to be slow. We need to be hypervigilant. We need to be on top of everything. Like, this is how we're going to survive here. So I think there's a component of that happens as well. Like, I had a patient that every single calming formula we gave her caused like hysteria. And she had such a huge like CPTSD history that we had to like resource and get into safety and get into EMDR and get into all of those pieces and then start with like drop wise dosing of things. We went to tinctures and we were like, okay, let's just go super slow and go from there. And so it's a really important thing to navigate and even look at, like in some of my patients with a lot of anxiety, and you can see how much their life is set up around it and how much their hypervigilance is set up to like facilitate. I'll ask questions about alcohol. I'll ask questions about weed or like other medicinal substances. How do you respond? Right? How do you respond when your cognitive ability to control slows down? And I'll just see what they say. And there are oftentimes that there's correlations between those types of people. So those are kind of the three levels you're looking at when someone has that paradoxical response. Melatonin is a similar one, right? Like, is it safe to sleep? Because if it's not safe to sleep, your body's going to keep you awake. There's nervous system in a nutshell.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you had as much fun as we did. And if you loved today's episode, share it with a friend and leave us a review. That is how we spread this message, and that is how we are going to revolutionize healthcare in Canada for women. Have a beautiful day and be well.